Hi there. Thanks for joining our webinar today. We'll be talking about strategies to lead your district's move from frustrating and paper-based to smart and online and smooth. So let's jump in. My goal for you today is to walk away with a better idea of where to start, how to prioritize, and then redesign your painful processes. How to then take that redesign process and build a smart online form with approval workflows and e-signatures. And then a little bonus on data sets. So let's jump in. First, who am I? My name is Nick Duell. I'm based in Massachusetts. I started my career as a high school chemistry teacher for 8 years, where I really fell in love with infusing technology into my lessons and classroom. But then I started to realize that there was lots of inefficiency swirling around my classroom out in the building that could benefit from an infusion of technology as well. So I caught the bug and I started to move into administration to really work on some of those process improvement sorts of things. From there, I became a director of instructional technology, where I was responsible for process improvement and edtech management in a medium-sized urban district spanning 15 schools. One of the things that we rolled out in my district was Droplet, which was the platform that we used to solve the problem that is the subject of this webinar. And so I was so impressed with the product and the team behind it that I joined Droplet as a subject matter expert. And now in this role, I help districts do exactly what I did in my own district. I'm grateful that you're tuning in. I know your time is super, super valuable. I want to share some concrete examples and some real takeaways with you. And I hope that this helps you think about how to improve your district's processes. So let's jump right in with a quick reflection question. What I want to know is what percentage of your district's processes are currently digitized? Now, it's possible that you fit into any of these buckets, but it's likely that you're in maybe the top two, one of the top two, from 0 to 50%. And so if that's the case, this webinar is going to be really applicable to you. If a lot of your district's processes are already online, that's excellent too. But you may pick up some tips and tricks as you continue to evaluate some of those processes, or as you move some of those processes that are still the old way over to the new way. So let's jump in with my first recommendation, which is how to prioritize and then redesign. I've got 3 kind of subpoints underneath this. As you think about your district's org chart and all the different departments and schools that exist across your district, list all of the processes that drain time, that cause confusion or frustration, or that lead to waste, whether that's money or other resources. And it's probably pretty easy, I would say, for you to come up with a list of these processes, but it might be a little trickier for you to rank them or prioritize them. And that's really what you should do as the first step, is where do you start? And what's your roadmap for continuing once you've converted one painful process to a nice smooth one? You can think of this in this quadrant sort of diagram where you've got 2 factors, complexity and frequency. Now in this diagram, the higher up a dot is, the more complex it is. And the further to the right, the more frequently that process happens. Now I know complexity can be subjective because sometimes it's the people that are part of the process that make it more or less complex. But I've got 4 questions you could ask. 1, does a lot of information need to be gathered? A student enrollment packet is a great example of something that's really got a lot of moving pieces to it. You need to ask questions about biographical data, health records, IEP and 504 and EL, tons of stuff as part of that process. If the answer is yes, then that's going to be a more complex process. Secondly, is there information that's only needed in certain circumstances? For example, if you've got a student who's not SPED, you don't have to ask about IEP. Whereas if you do have a student who's on an IEP, you should ask a lot of questions about that, and you probably already do. The third question, does the process involve multiple departments? So a really great example of this could be a field trip request might need approval from everybody under the sun. Business, curriculum, transportation, the nurse, superintendent, maybe even the board if it's an overnight trip or maybe an overseas trip. That adds to the complexity for sure. And then the last question, does the process involve varying reviewers? In other words, every time this process happens, maybe a slightly different set of people should be reviewing the requests. For example, in my district, our CTE director would really only weigh in as an approver if the requester was a CTE teacher or in some way was connected to CTE. but wouldn't otherwise. And so you could answer yes to all 4 of these questions, in which case that's a really complex process. But it's possible that not all 4 apply to it, which would lower the complexity. So I recommend you submit your list of pain points to this just quick check to help you rank them in complexity. And that will actually help you draw out a diagram like this where the different dots representing painful processes in your district are higher or lower. Of course, left to right would really just be about how frequently those processes take place throughout the school year. The top right quadrant is where your heartbreakers live. This is where you've got people who are frustrated or they're wasting a ton of time because you've got a painful, complex process that happens frequently. And so I recommend you start here. Once you've identified what your top right quadrant processes are, that's where you should really start to focus your efforts if you want to make a big impact right away. From there, you can move to these 2 quadrants, which are still painful, but not as painful, because in the lower right corner, they don't happen with as much complexity. A good example there might be a permission slip. That happens quite frequently throughout the year, I'm sure you can imagine, but you're really only probably gathering a student ID and name and maybe a parent signature. Well, probably a parent signature. Whereas a top left quadrant example varies in greater complexity but less frequency. In my district, our homeschooling application didn't happen all that often, but when it did, we really wanted to gather a lot of information to be able to review that request. No matter how you plan to tackle it, though, it's good to have a central place to list out and rank these processes. So we developed a Google Sheet to organize our list of painful processes, and then we prioritize them. There's a little button that says sort by priority. We shared this sheet with department heads and principals so that they always knew what we were working on currently and what was up on deck. Now, you'll be getting a copy of this spreadsheet for free if it'll help you organize your district's efforts in this area. For a concrete example, this is what my district started with. This was our top right quadrant dot. The professional development requests. Now, these came in often and often wrong. This one checked all 4 of those complexity boxes. And you can see why if you just look through it. Form must be completed 15 working days before dates requested. How many of these do you think came in within 15 days? Be sure to attach required backup. Refer to backup documentation required document for details. So there was a separate document about documentation. This, I think at some point was a spreadsheet, but eventually it turned into a PDF or became paper-based as people would print it out. And that little total area really wouldn't work anymore, of course. And so folks would be scribbling that out and hand totaling, sometimes calculated incorrectly in the margin there, which of course, for obvious reasons, was not ideal. Sometimes they didn't have the signature of the principal before they sent it over to central office for reviews. And if we scroll down, you can see that there is a workflow here. It's supposed to go from the assistant superintendent to budget grants to the superintendent for final approval, but it was followed with mixed fidelity. Submitters may have become annoyed with this entire process, maybe not knowing exactly where it was once they submitted it, and they may have decided to just abandon the request altogether, or maybe they were just less keen to do it next time. And so for us, this was our main heartbreaker. We felt if we could clean up this process, we could prevent a ton of grief and show our teachers that we value their professional development and want to invest in it. So the next thing we did was gathered the right team, and I suggest you do the same. 6 is plenty. A form champion, someone to lead and facilitate the process. A submission manager, that's going to be somebody who's going to monitor day-to-day submissions. They could be an administrative assistant or a specialist of some sort. Up to 3 members of relevant departments, especially if the process involves multiple departments. It's really good to have a representative from each. And then somebody who's school-based, somebody who might be a principal. They could be a teacher. They could be an ideal end user of some sort for your process. Once you've got that team together, draw out what your process is if it currently exists. If it doesn't currently exist, draw out what your process should be. But most cases, you have some idea of a process, in which case at this point you should be cleaning up questions on the form, making some of those questions less confusing, noting where you'd like automatic actions to take place, maybe in some cases removing steps if maybe only a person needs to just be notified as opposed to involved in the approval process. These are some examples of my district drawing out our process. It's kind of funny in the left picture there to think that in trying to go paperless, we reached for a giant piece of paper to help us. But you can see we graduated to a whiteboard here with employee onboarding on the right, and then eventually started to digitize some of these. FigJam from Figma is an excellent low-lift free tool for education-based accounts. You could just use something as easy as PowerPoint or Google Slides or Keynote, something to kind of lay out your whole process. So we drew this out. This is for our PD request. As you can see, there's lots of complexity here. The submitter starts it off, of course, but then what you have is based on that submitter's position, it goes to a lot of different options of people for this second step here before then going to that person's principal. And if they're a counselor, we wanted to notify folks. The principal would then choose the funding type, and then based on the funding type, there'd be another branch here where it's possible that, grants needed to weigh in or special ed needed to weigh in. The assistant superintendent for curriculum would sign off on the content of the conference before going to the budget director, before going to the superintendent, and then finally the submitter we wanted to be notified at the end when everything was entirely approved. And so this leads me to my second recommendation, which is start putting your drawing into action. Now, my district chose Droplet for a variety of reasons, but chief among them, it was because this was the platform that could take our drawing and make it reality. We could match what we drew, and that's critical. We didn't need to fit our process to a platform. We could fit the platform to our process. Droplet has really dynamic routing for approval workflows. Like you saw in that last diagram, we were able to do that. We could do e-signatures. It was really well designed and mobile friendly. Our team discussed that a lot of our users are going to be using cell phones or tablets. And so we wanted to make sure we had a system that could handle that. In short, it had all the must-haves and a lot of the nice-to-haves too. So I want to show you just a few of the features that made us make the jump to Droplet, but know that these will be my recommendations no matter what you choose. So we turned our old dusty form from this into this. Beautiful, isn't it? Now, I want to lead you through just a few things I want to talk about when it comes to building smart online forms. I could talk to you about this for hours, but these four are a good starting point. It's certainly not an exhaustive list. So let's start with the first recommendation, which is to anticipate confusion. And we'll actually jump into Droplet here. This is what our professional development request looks like. My first recommendation about this is to have clear instructions. So this is maybe a little underrated, but it's good to have some instructions about when someone should fill this out. Then we've also got some tooltips here. So we were asking for a position before. We were just having people fill in what their position was, and very often that was just staff. So instead, choose the closest description that matches your position. What we also did was we limited the options so that they were exactly what we were looking for. If somebody said athletics, we wanted the athletics director to be part of this. Whereas if they just said educator or other staff member, then it might continue on a more regular workflow. So narrowing answers using dropdowns prevents junk data. It also helped us potentially prepare reports because we could then limit by, let's say, filter by nurse, if that was pertinent information we were trying to report on. Another example is just providing hints where it's relevant. So requests must be made 15 working days in advance, right where the dates would be, or describing what the backup documentation is, right where we have them upload backup documentation. So this could be a screenshot of conference registration, travel, lodging, those sorts of things. Placeholder text was also helpful, just to give a little sentence starter. And then marking certain fields as required. If I just hit submit here, you can see it's going to highlight everything that I need to fill in order to complete this form. So anticipating confusion, it's a big part of this process, and it's going to kind of be a theme as we go through my next few recommendations as well. The next one is to rely on math. So let's take a look at what that looks like. I'm just going to hit refresh here. So the start date as a good example. If we are wanting this start date to be no sooner than 15 working days out, which would be 3 weeks, then we can make it so that, today is the 8th. The earliest date I can choose then would be the 29th of April. And so this essentially ensures that every single request is going to be within the allowable time period. If I picked that date and maybe picked May 1st, there's 3 days. I could have maybe multiple trips. It's possible that, I'm applying for, a multi-day, multi-event offering, maybe put on by the state or something like that. Well, now it's totaling up the number of days. In my district, we had a maximum allowable amount for meals of $50 a day. So down in the expenses area, we could just have that meals calculating to ensure that, that's done properly every time. But then also this total is going to be calculating everything here. So maybe this is $130. Lodging here might be, $400, something like that. Transportation, maybe we've got, 50 miles round trip. We've got a mileage rate in the background here that's multiplying 50 by that rate to get us $33.85, and then it's throwing it in the total. So really cool, but also ensuring that we're not going to get errors. I want to show you another example. This is on our preschool registration form. So here, this is for parents to fill out if they have a child. Let's say it's Lisa, who was born in April of 2020, April 8th. Well, on September 1st of 2024, which would be this school year, September 1st, Lisa would be 4. But if we fast forward to 2021, maybe Lisa was born then. Now she's 3. That brings in a different option. We fast forward to April 2022. Well, now Lisa's not old enough to even attend preschool registration based on her age as of September 1st. And so you can see this says preschool is only available for students age 3 and older as of September 1st. Look at this. Since Lisa will be 2 on September 1st, we cannot consider them for enrollment this year. So a parent's going to be a lot less likely to get their student's date of birth or their child's date of birth wrong than they will be to get, the age calculated as of September 1st of the relevant school year wrong. But as a school district, we know what we're looking for, and we can just include that calculation as part of the form itself and can educate the parent on maybe why, in that case, their child isn't yet eligible for preschool. My next recommendation is to only show what's needed. And I actually gave you a little bit of a preview of that in the last example. This piece here is only showing based upon the value of the student's age. But if I go back to my PD request, we've got a couple examples where that's the case too. Here I've got the school or department field. Someone could pick a school, of course, but maybe they don't work at a school. Maybe instead they work at a department, in which case they'd pick departments. And now look, a separate field opens based on the fact that this one says departments. And then someone can choose their department from this list. So that's showing only what's needed. Maybe they pick communications or curriculum and instruction. And then finally, down here, once someone had signed, Nick, well, now this timestamps when their signature appeared. And so this date didn't exist prior. Once there's been a signature entered, now we've got a timestamp associated with that signature. So only showing what's needed, really, really critical, especially for reducing confusion. And of course, if you can reduce confusion, you're going to reduce frustration, because confusion leads to phone calls or emails about the process. And if those happen over and over again, that leads to a more frustrating process. Lastly, getting it to the right people. Now I can show you the workflow for this. This is what this looks like in Droplet. And so every submission starts here. And then based on what people say as part of their submission, it will know how to dynamically route through this workflow. The admin step here would be determined based on someone's position. So if they were, let's say, an EL educator, then the director of EL might weigh in. And so that's what that is. From there, it would go to the person's principal, which would be determined based on their school. So let's say they went with Brookfield Middle School. This is actually saying, hey, great, your request will initially be reviewed by Oliver East, principal, before routing through central office for additional review. But if they chose a department like facilities, your request will be initially reviewed by Kevin Garcia, director of facilities. So it's dynamically looking for who would be that person's principal or director if they're part of a department. From there, the principal or director would establish the funding source, in which case it goes to the appropriate funding step. And then from there, it just continues through some standard central office approvers. This might be the assistant superintendent for curriculum and the business office, and maybe the superintendent before being completed or rejected. Of course, could be rejected along the way or sent back for corrections as needed. Super dynamic. Another thing that I think is really critical is after this step here, the users get a notification to their email. In this case, this said, hey, Nick, your professional development request has been received and is now being processed by the necessary administrators. Please don't proceed with administrators with registration or bookings until you receive full approval. But then they have this link here that brings them to the live submission. So they can see along the workflow process exactly where their request is. And that makes the process a ton more transparent. It cuts down on calls and confusion and just makes everything much, much better. Now, finally, using data sets. Now, this is, like I mentioned, kind of magical, but a data set is similar to a spreadsheet of information or a database. It could be a list of schools in your district with maybe who the principals are. It could be budget codes for like account numbers for budgeting. Maybe it's course catalog information from your student information system. But then the nice thing about this is your district may have multiple forms. Most districts, of course, do. And your data set can connect to each of those forms so that as centralized information like who's the principal of the high school and what's that account code for student activities this fiscal year, as that information changes, it makes sure that all of the forms reference the most up-to-date information. So you don't have to go from form to form and update each of those things. It's really, really critical. So let me show you what this looks like. I just have a couple example data sets here. Here's a data set on schools. So this lists all the schools and departments, but I could look at Sunset High School. Principal there's Adrian Watterson. Sunset High School's got some grades 9 through 12, looks like. Maybe some clubs listed out. And the middle school principal, oh, there's Oliver East. If you notice, this list of schools matches this list here. And that's not by surprise. This dropdown is looking live at what this list is. Another example here, budget codes change every fiscal year in a lot of cases. And so you could set up fiscal years with the different line items from your budget. And, these are made up numbers, but a budget code associated with those line items. And then every year, you would just enter in these new budget codes. And so maybe you're using Droplet for purchase requisitions. This would then always be looking at the correct budget code information. So data sets are incredibly powerful. I really recommend that you use data sets because it's going to keep everything updated and aligned across your district. So one last reflection before we wrap up, and that's what is the biggest challenge your district faces in digitizing processes? Because preparing for these challenges is going to be a good thing to do before you start this process. In some cases, it might be budgetary constraints. I was fortunate enough in my district where the prevailing thought was that investing in smoother, modern processes was critical, especially when it came to keeping ahead of the curve with staffing shortages. The question was always, what would it cost if we don't make these changes now? But secondly, some reluctance that you might experience across the district. Change is hard. Some people are perfectly happy with how things have always been. So I've found in my experience that validating that it's scary is a good first step. The next step would be to include that person in the redesign process. If they feel like their voice is part of the process and they understand how the change is going to take place, that will be a huge help. So I hope that this has been helpful. Thank you for tuning in. My contact information is just below this little box here. Feel free to drop me an email anytime, or to check out the Droplet website at droplet.io. A member of my team would be thrilled to talk to you about your district, its unique challenges, and how Droplet might be able to help. Thanks.